Welcome, everybody. So excited to see you for our second to last session for the Specialized Wildlife and Project Design Training. I'm really pleased to introduce and welcome Dr. Alexander Cromwell here to join us today. Dr. Cromwell, or Alex as I know him, because it was before PhD. And I have collaborated on a number of different projects in Indonesia and Thailand, and really focused on the intersection of enabling youth leaders to be their best and most effective, and really think about project design and outcomes that are beneficial for people, for community, and for the environment. And so he has a lot of expertise in program design and monitoring and evaluation, which he's used to share with groups that I've led before, and really excited to learn from him. He's also a great facilitator and really great person to know. So maybe, Alex, you can start out with a little bit more about your background, and then we can jump into the training. So welcome, Alex. Thanks for joining us.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Patrick. Yeah. Well, yeah, so I was very excited when Patrick reached out to me. As you mentioned, we've worked together on a number of projects, mostly with youth, mostly in Asia. And yeah, so just a little bit about me. So I got my PhD in conflict resolution. I've focused my research and work, a lot of it's focused on youth, mostly on peace education and thinking about how youth can engage in peace building work. I've done a lot of research and work in Indonesia and also in South Asia, Pakistan, places like that. I have not been lucky enough to travel to the African continent yet, but it is definitely on my bucket list. And yeah, I'm at George Washington University right now. I teach classes on conflict resolution and research, a lot of research methods classes, which is a bit relevant here in terms of thinking about how do we collect data to make sure we're doing the most effective projects we can to help communities. And in the past, taught at American University and did a bunch of classes on project design and used to take students abroad into the field, and a lot of that involved working with Patrick as well. So anyway, I'm very excited to be here and speak to all of you. So in this session today, right, we're thinking about needs analysis and project design. And let me pull up my slides here. Okay.
And Alex, let me just jump in real quick as you're getting set up.
Sure.
Just to contextualize this for the group here and also who will tune in. This is a session that we really want people to think about understanding the how and why we decide to have a certain intervention or certain project. And so last week we talked about different potential solutions to wildlife conflict, for example. And what we're going to do here with Alex's session is really think about the technical way we figure out what is the right way to do something, and what does the community or the problem actually need. So this will really help inform the future conversations we have very soon about what projects we're going to do and how we're going to make an impact. So yeah, let's dive into it with Alex. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for that context, Patrick. Yeah. So exactly. So we really want to think today about, okay, what does it mean, to figure out what problem it is you're going to try to address, right? And what does it look like to try to develop some sort of project that can help whatever problem it is you're trying to ameliorate. So with that in mind, we're going to look at three kind of major tools that can be useful for you in designing a project. We're going to talk about a needs analysis, and one of the most useful tools when doing a needs analysis is developing a problem tree and then turning that into an objectives tree, and we'll talk all about that. Another really useful tool is called a logical framework, or a log frame for short. Most of the time when you apply for a grant, when you have put together a proposal, you have to put together a log frame, which basically says, here are our goals, here are our objectives, here's what we're trying to do, and here are some of the activities we're going to do to make that happen, and here's how we're going to try to measure it and make a case for what we've actually tried to achieve here. And then the final thing we'll talk about. All right. Finally, we'll be talking about theories of change, right? Which really have to do with what's the underlying theory that we have about how we think we're actually going to be creating change in the community that we're working in. So to get started, let's talk a little bit about what actually a project entails, right? So a project has kind of three key elements, right? First of all, there's a specific target population, right? There's beneficiaries, people or wildlife in this case, right, that you're trying to help. You're trying to somehow make an impact with beneficiaries. Second, there's a specific time frame, right? You have a goal and you say, okay, within this certain amount of time, I'm going to try to get this thing done. When you're applying for grants, often it's 1 to 2 years. In your case, maybe it'll be a few weeks or a few months that you're trying to get this done. And finally, you have specifically designated resources, right? And in this case, for all of you, the biggest resource will be your time. There'll be a number of you working in a group, in a team, trying to make this happen. And the question will also be for you, what other resources, or as we say in the project design world, inputs do you need to make this thing happen? Okay. So with that in mind, first and foremost, what we need to do is determine the problem, figure out what the problem is that we're trying to address. What's the issue that we're trying to improve or make better? And when doing this, the first kind of step is doing what's called a needs assessment, right? And so in ideal terms, that might involve a survey, interviews, or focus groups. But basically what you want to do is somehow meet with and interface with beneficiaries, right? In other words, you want to have contact with people that you would be trying to help or making a difference for, to get a clear sense of what the problem is. And one of the most useful tools for doing this is conducting a problem tree analysis. So we're going to spend the next probably 15, 20 minutes or so talking through what a problem tree looks like. I'll give you some examples. And then you're going to be designing your own problem tree for a problem, for the local communities in Namibia. Sorry, someone's sound is coming through. Okay, I think we're okay. All right. So briefly, just to talk about what a problem tree is. It's a great visual tool also just for thinking about what the problem you're trying to address is, what the causes are, and what the effects are, right? So if we look at the visual here, the problem tree identifies a core problem you want to address, right? So this is the trunk of the tree, the center here. Can you see my cursor too? Does that come through or not? Like when I move my cursor around, or is that?
It's not coming through.
Okay.
Maybe a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, I can see
it's
it.
coming through.
Okay. All right. Okay, great. So the trunk is the main problem, and then the roots are the causes, right? What are the main issues that are causing this problem to happen, right? And the way we figure that out is by asking the question, why? Why is this problem happening? And it's a great visual, right? Because again, the roots of a tree are the foundation of the tree, right? So in the same way, the roots of the problem are the underlying deep things that we want to try to address and improve so that the problem gets improved, right? And then finally, the branches are the effects of the problem, right? And so these are, because of the problem happens, what are the consequences of it? And so I'll give you an example in a moment here. But before we dive into problem trees more specifically, I wanted to think about one of the most important things when designing a problem tree is involving as many stakeholders as possible, right? So of course you want to involve all of the people that you're working with and trying to help, right? Whose situation you're trying to improve, but also you want to involve as many people, as many relevant stakeholders as you can. So why might it be so important to include as many beneficiaries and stakeholders as you can? You can just you could type a response in the chat, or you can raise your hand and chime in here. But I'd love to hear any thoughts you have on when doing this needs assessment process, when developing a problem tree, why might it be so critical or important to involve as many stakeholders and beneficiaries as possible? Any thoughts?
Diversity of opinion.
Diversity of opinion. Okay, so why is diversity of opinion important?
Well, every group is going to be able to pinpoint different shortfalls of your project. So if you're only including one particular viewpoint, I think it would be pretty easy to have a variety of shortfalls that you might not see, but that another group might. And I guess it's sort of the age-old thing of cooperation sort of makes things better because you can all work together to solve the problems that individually you might not know, but together you could all address at one time.
Absolutely, right. So getting as many people in as possible also gets more buy-in, right? People feel like their voices have been heard, they've been included in the process. There's not just something arbitrary happening. Also, you're not only helping some and not others in the community, right? So you're really including as many as you can and really making sure that everyone's ideas are aired. Okay, great. Maybe one or two more. What else? Why else might it be important?
It makes sure that you're able to adequately address the problem that's actually going on in that region and not just relying on one person or one group's input.
Right. The most important thing too is are we addressing the most important problem? Are we addressing the most important cause of this problem? Right. We may think something is the biggest issue, but maybe it's not. Right. And so let me give you a great example that kind of helps to outline this. So a colleague of mine, Cindy Collins, did some work in Tanzania, right? And the problem they were trying to address was a lack of women's economic empowerment, right? So specifically, the problem was there was too many women selling cassava in the same market, right? Which makes it too cheap, right? If there's too much supply, the demand goes down, and nobody really wants to spend much money in it because there's lots of options, right? So because this was happening, they thought, okay, well, if this is the problem, we're going to have two objectives, right? First, we're going to try to improve women's market access. Okay, so we're going to do that by getting them to other communities, right? So they started busing them to other local communities, and they started saying, okay, we're instead of having 10 people selling cassava in this one market, we'll have 3 people go to this other one, 3 people go to this other one, etc. The other one was teaching them alternative livelihoods, right? So give them other options so that not everyone's selling cassava, but other people are engaging in other types of work. So luckily they did a problem tree and they realized this was actually a bit too simplistic, because what they found was from the problem tree, they found out there was 2 other major problems. The first of them was that families were stealing from the women, right? So no matter, if the families are stealing from the women, no matter how much money women are making, that's still going to be a critical issue, right? So then they created an activity to help them keep their money safe, so the money wouldn't be stolen anymore. The second one was they realized the women didn't trust each other. And so, of course, right, again, no matter how much you try to spread out where women are selling these things and giving them alternative livelihoods, if fundamentally they're not trusting each other, they're not willing to collaborate, they're not willing to work together in the marketplace, then there's going to be an underlying issue there, right? So then they created an activity to create trust among the women, right? And so hopefully this example kind of illustrates the really key importance of saying, okay, let's talk to people, right, in the community. Let's make sure that we really have a sense of what the causes of the problem are here. So we're not designing, band-aid solutions that don't really address root issues. Okay, so I want to give you, just to make sure we kind of understand what a problem tree looks like, I'm going to give you a very simple example. So let's say you have a problem where teenagers don't finish school, right? And so to determine the cause of this problem, we say, okay, so why don't teenagers finish school? So if you look at the center of the image here, you have the core problem: teenagers don't finish school. Oops. And then so the causes are the roots of the tree, right? And so we have, okay, so why don't teenagers finish school, right? Okay, well, maybe it's because parents don't encourage them. And then another thing to think about when it comes to the problem tree is sometimes there may be causes underlying causes, right? So we want to keep asking why until we really have gotten to the root cause at least as much as possible, right? So parents don't encourage them. Okay, well, why aren't parents encouraging them? Maybe parents don't think school is important, or maybe parents are too busy to discipline or support them. Or maybe another cause is that school is not interesting, right? And that could be because, well, maybe the curriculum is not applicable to what students are interested in. Maybe the teachers aren't engaging students in an effective way. And then finally, it could be because teenagers need to find employment to support their family, and that could be because they have a low family income, right? And then in terms of effects, right, the branches are the effects. So teenagers not going to school can lead to various problems, right, such as they have trouble finding a job, and then there's low future income, which then again, we could see how these problems are cyclical, right? So they have low future income, which then leads to low family income, which then leads to more and more kids not finishing school, right? So people end up in cycles of poverty, for example. Could lead to higher teenage pregnancy, higher drug and alcohol use, et cetera, et cetera. So again, this is a very simple example, but hopefully this is getting you to start seeing just what a problem tree looks like and how it breaks down. And the biggest kind of value here that we'll be talking about next is this allows you to develop an objective tree analysis. So the basic idea is by figuring out what the problem is and what the root causes are, you could start thinking through what are some causes that might be relevant for you to work on to actually improve the situation. So that's where we're headed. But before we do that, I wanted to give you all a few minutes to start thinking about what a problem, and I know you've already, again, as Patrick said last week, you were already talking about some of the problems you might be trying to address in your projects, right? But I want to give you a few minutes to start thinking about what's a wildlife conservation related problem you'd like to address. And again, the core problem, right, is what goes to the center of the trunk. So let's say, we had teenagers not finishing school, but in the Namibian context, one problem, right, is that more and more rhinos are getting poached, for example, right? So that could be the core problem you're trying to address, and you want to think about, okay, what are the causes of this, right? And then what are the effects? So, so try to come up with a problem that you're interested in addressing, and try to come up with at least 3 likely causes of the problem, and then think through also, are there underlying factors that could make these causes come about? And then what are at least 3 likely effects of the problem? And then most importantly, right, to what we were just talking about, how can you determine which causes are most relevant? What information do you need to gain from local beneficiaries? In other words, what kinds of needs assessment are you going to do, right? You're not going to be doing a survey or interviews or things like that, but how are you going to talk to local people to really get a clear sense of what the problem is, and to make sure that, again, you're not addressing causes that aren't necessarily the most important causes. So I'm going to give you about 5 minutes and if you have a piece of paper or a pen in front of you, you can actually draw this, or if you have your computer, you can just kind of write this out in a document. But I want you to think about, again, what's a problem? What are 3, and then at least 3 causes, and then at least 3 effects. Does anyone have any questions before we get started on this? Okay, great. And when we're done, I'll ask a few people just to just share out the problem and maybe one or 2 causes that they thought of, as well as 1 or 2 effects. Okay, so give you 5 minutes. Let's get started.
While we're doing this, do any Namibians have any musical suggestions that I can play to give us some inspiration? Add it to the chat here, and I'll see if I can cue it up.
Got about 2 more minutes.
Hey, Alex, we got a good question in the chat here.
Okay, let's see. Is it okay to read? Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you can definitely, Mikhail, it's a great question. You can definitely read from a paper, and so, I would say in general, right, for any of these problems you're dealing with, it's definitely a good idea to draw from research on the topic for sure, right? So if there's research you can draw from that really identifies what problems are, or that talk about an issue, then you can absolutely draw from it as you think through what the problem is and how to identify it and how to address it. So that's a great question. The key is to just make sure that we're not only using written sources, but also engaging with community members as well and hearing what they have to say. And also, sorry, I didn't really have my eyes properly on the chat earlier, so I just wanted to mention Nadine and Albertina both made great points about the importance of including various stakeholders and beneficiaries, right? Both in terms of the importance of inclusivity and getting everyone's input on solutions, and also the strengths and weaknesses that various people bring in. So thank you for those comments as well. Okay, and so great. So hopefully that gave you enough time to at least come up with a problem and think through a few causes. Of course, there will be more time, right? This is just an hour session now. Over the coming weeks, you'll be thinking through what problems you're going to address, right? And being put into teams later as you really concretely decide what you're going to work on. But hopefully this has got you started thinking about it, right? This is really just a brainstorming piece. So yeah, so I'd love to hear from a few. You can so maybe for those of you, if you have typed this up, you can also throw it in the chat, but just maybe say what a problem you thought of is, and at least one kind of cause you thought of that may be influencing it, and any thoughts you have too on, and also one effect, those can be in the chat. And then when I ask you, if you want to turn on your microphone and speak here, I would say, and then if you also have any thoughts on, if you also have any thoughts on, how you can determine which causes are most relevant, right? How you're going to engage with local people to really get a sense of these things. Any thoughts you have on that would also be great. So yeah, so you can go ahead and raise your hand or just jump in here, but love to hear, and also throw it in the chat. But love to hear any kind of problems and causes people came up with so far. Okay, yeah, that's fine. Pate Moshela, that's fine. You can put that in the chat. Yeah, definitely feel free to just put it in the chat. We'll discuss whatever shows up in the chat as well. Yeah, don't feel like you have to put it all. Just put, the problem, the cause. Okay. Yeah, Vikhail, am I saying that right? How do you say that? Vichale? Vichal. Thank you. Sorry about that. Okay. Hello.
But why? So I did a problem tree analysis today, and the is the trunk
I'm sorry, it's a little bit hard to hear. Did you say poor waste
and
management?
for the roots, which are the causes, I have
Sorry, it's actually
lack of
it's sorry, the sound really isn't coming through. Is that same for everyone else? Is it not really coming through for others as
for
well?
proper
Okay.
waste
So can you sorry, can you type it and put it in the
land
chat?
use management, that is the problem that I'm facing.
Okay. Michelle, sorry, can you just type, can you put it in the chat, please? I'm sorry.
On the
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Are
We
you
can't, we really
with
can't
me?
hear you. Yeah, would you mind just typing it? And we can discuss it once it's in the chat. I apologize.
cutting off.
I know. Okay.
Oh, we may have lost her.
Okay. All right. Okay, well, we'll come back to her when we, when she's able to put it in the chat. Anyone else want to chime in? Okay. Okay. Now, Dean, I say you said my root problem is lack of water. Okay. So Jody says wildlife and human conflict and increase in the human population causes more interaction between humans and animals, as well as settlement patterns. Okay, great. Okay, Nadine, no worries. You can keep typing. So how about this? Okay, degradation of natural habitats. Okay, Omagano says degradation of natural habitats causes greed, urbanization, development. Justicia, I would go with matters on wildlife conservation between the private sector and communities. Okay, Kate. So yeah, you all can just read the problems as they're coming in. This is great to see some of the ideas you all have. The problem we talked about. So Kate said the problem we talked about addressing is the uncertainty of whether new generations in Namibia will continue prioritizing the conservancy system. Okay. Right. So let's say, okay, since Kate's is the most recent one up here, so let's just say that that's right. So let's say that this problem is, the uncertainty of whether new generations in Namibia will continue prioritizing the conservancy system, right? So that's the problem, right? Let's say that's the problem you want to address. You said one of the causes is lack of wildlife education, right? So then the next step is, okay, and again, you can think through various causes, but let's say your sense is, okay, this is the cause that matters, or this is the most important cause, or this is the cause that we might be able to do something towards. Well, so and let's say that you start talking to people in the community and you start seeing very clearly that, some of the older people in the community maybe are worried that the younger, maybe youth in the community don't seem as invested. Let's say that's the issue, right? Then the question would be, okay, what are the next steps? Well, the next step is the objective tree analysis. And what you do in the objective tree analysis is it's a positive reframing showing the desired situation when responding to a problem shown in the tree. In other words, so give me a few moments and I'll break it out. So initially, right, the problem in the trunk is the problem, right? We clearly state what the problem is. But in the objectives tree, the problem then becomes the goal, right? So it goes from being this negative statement of a problem to a positive restatement of how you would address it, right? In other words, in the example we were just talking about, right? So would be the new generations in Namibia not prioritizing the conservancy system, right? That would be the problem. And the goal would be, right, new generations in Namibia prioritizing, right, continuing to prioritize the conservancy system, right? So that would be the goal. And then you take the causes, right, which are the roots, the causes of the problem, and then you change them from being negative to being positive as well. So it goes from being here are these negative problems to objectives that you can try to achieve to then meet your goal. So for example, if the problem is a lack of wildlife education, then or insufficient wildlife education, then you would say the objective is sufficient wildlife education, right? Or enough wildlife education. And then the effects, the branches go from being, right, the negative effects to then being the positive long-term impact of achieving your goal. And let me show you let me show you an example to help illustrate this. Remember we talked about, right, the core problem of teenagers not finishing school. So if we change that to an objectives analysis, right, it goes from being teenagers don't finish school to then our goal being, okay, our goal is that teenagers will finish school. Okay, now let's look at the root causes again, right? So then parents don't encourage them becomes parents encourage them. Okay, and then instead of parents not thinking school is important, they think it's important. Et cetera, et cetera. Right? School is not interesting, school is more interesting. Need to find employment to support your family, there's less need to find employment to support family. And then so the whole idea of this, right, is that as you flesh out these positive reframings of the causes, you start coming up with possible objectives that you can have for your project. Objectives are basically just very concrete goals. Sorry if you hear crying in the background. That is 6 weeks old Joseph, probably wanting milk or something. So yeah, and so the next step really is once you've once you've done your problem tree, right, and figured out what some of the causes are, and then you've reframed them, right, to now have a clear goal and then to have some possible objectives. The next step is looking at the objectives in the roots of your tree and selecting 1 or 2 to tackle, right? Because you can't tackle all the different causes of the problem, right? That's not feasible, that's not realistic. But you can pick a specific objective. For example, lack of knowledge of, the example we were talking about. Well, and I see lots of people have chimed in here, which is great. So we can possibly turn to some of those other examples you all put in here as well. But let's say, again, if lack of wildlife education is the problem, right, then your objective could be increased wildlife education, right? And then you can say, wow, what are concrete things we can do to make there be increased wildlife education? Right, so looking at the slide here, some things to think about as you choose your objectives are, what is achievable in the time frame you have, right? Projects, again, always have a bounded time frame. So the question is, how much time do you have and what can you achieve in that time frame? 2, what are your greatest strengths and skills that would help in addressing the problem? In other words, and this will be, right, you'll have a group of people later on, a group of, in your team, it'll be, what are the strengths and skills we're bringing here that make us most suited to, to dealing with one of these objectives? And then also, what's your team's capacity? And then another question always is there funding? If so, how much is there? Okay, so and briefly before, so I'm going to give you a few minutes. In a couple minutes, I'm going to give you some time to think about how to change some of your causes into an objective and think about, what might be some activities you could do to achieve that objective. But before we do that, I wanted to briefly touch on log frames because they link very nicely here in thinking about project design. So because basically the objectives analysis is particularly useful because it directly relates to logical frameworks that help to clarify how to think about the activities we propose. So log frames are the basic underlying structure followed throughout the project cycle. And the reason why, as I was saying, right, anytime you apply for a grant, usually you have to submit a logical framework, right, a log frame, thinking it all through. And I know you all watched the video that talked about the different elements of a log frame, right? But basically, they're used to ensure the project stays on track, right? So when you design a project, you think through your objectives and you think through the activities you want to do, and you think through how you're going to measure them. And the idea is you're going to use this log frame to monitor your project as you're working on it to see if you're achieving the outcomes you hope to achieve, and then to evaluate it at the end. And the idea is that all these elements are interrelated, right? And so if one fails, the rest fail. So basically there's a logic here where you do Now, at the very end, you'll see the goal, right? So often you're working backwards from the goal. So you have a goal, right? Which again is at the center of the tree. Then you have one or two objectives, specific, right? Specific objectives you're working on to make progress towards that goal. And so the idea is when you achieve outcomes, and you've met your objectives, and that you're consistent, and that you're engaging in different activities in your projects, which then lead to outputs. Achieving all of your outputs leads to outcomes, which meet your objectives, which then contribute to your goal. Okay, so, and I'll do another visual here to think through a little bit more clearly how this works, right? So in other words, you have a goal which leads to your overall impact, which again is, right, the branches of the tree. So you have a goal which leads to impact. You have objectives. When you meet your objectives, you lead to outcomes, and you have activities that lead to outputs, and you have indicators at each level. And what indicators are the specific ways you're going to measure whether you achieve what you said you would achieve. In other words, if you're doing an activity where you're training, you're training people on wildlife education, the output would be, let's say 50 trained youth on wildlife education. And then the indicator would be, clearly measuring whether or not that actually happened. And so if you're off of the way you would do that, if you want to say, oh, have we improved people's attitudes, for example, from doing this project, you might do, a pre-test survey and then a post-test survey looking at attitudes before and after, for example. And I have a little image here that might help as well. So here's an example log frame. Let's say your overall, if you look at the top here, right? So you have deliverable, indicator, means of verification, and assumption, right? So in terms of deliverable, you have your overall goal. Let's say your overall goal is to reduce child mortality. And then you work backwards, okay? So basically, okay, if we want to reduce child mortality, what do we need to do? Well, we need to reduce incidence of waterborne illness. So let's say you have specific objectives that are focused on reducing waterborne illness. And the question is, okay, if we want to reduce waterborne illness, what kind of outputs do we need? And so here we have, okay, we're gonna create latrines, and we're gonna do an awareness campaign. So then the question is, okay, what activities do we need to do to have those outputs? So here we have new latrine sites, latrine plans, right, as activities that will create outputs of latrines. Then we have sanitation workshops, which will lead to an output of an awareness campaign. And again, the indicator is measuring whether or not that output was achieved. So in this case, let's say, okay, we're going to build, 10 new latrine sites, and that way we know we've achieved our output. And the means of verification is just how you will go about measuring that indicator. So in this case, they would say, okay, we would visit the community and we would see whether the latrines are built or not. So again, right, the output of latrines being built could then reduce incidence of waterborne illness. And the question is, okay, how will we measure that? Well, we're going to measure the incidence of waterborne illness before and after the project is done. And our goal is that we're saying that, okay, if it's reduced by 20%, then we'll have met our goal of reducing waterborne illness. So we'll use a water survey to assess this. Okay, so anyway, that's just a little bit of the basics of what a log frame is and how it relates to projects and the objectives tree analysis that we were just talking about. Okay. Possible. All right. So the thing I'd like you to do next is you're going to think about the problem tree that you've worked on so far and answer the following questions, right? So can you change the problem to a positive statement to develop your overarching goal? Right? So take your problem tree, right? The trunk of your tree as your problem. Think about how you can rephrase that positively to meet your goal. Consider the causes of the problem you identified. Can you choose one and change it to a positive statement, right? So then it would be an objective, right? Instead of a problem. Sorry, instead of a cause. And then consider what else you would need to think through to make this objective feasible. And then are there some activities you could do to achieve this objective? So so I'll give you 5 minutes to work on this, but before we do that, does anyone have questions about the objective tree analysis or shifting from the problem tree to an objective tree analysis, and also just some of what I talked about in terms of log frames as you're thinking through what this might look like in terms of activities?
Hey, Alex, I know folks often have a hard time distinguishing between outputs and outcomes. Do you want to just try to clarify that a little bit? Because I think that's always helpful.
Absolutely, yeah. Great. So the output, let me go back to the image, right? The output is the very specific like thing that you will achieve through the activity, right? It's the very clearly measurable thing. So for example, often it's number of people trained, number of people who've been involved in this project, things like that, right? So in the example here, right, it's the number of latrines built. So you've built, it's most easily conceivable in terms of, okay, we've built this, we've built this concrete thing. We can see this thing that we've built. Now, the difference between outputs and outcomes, right, is that outcomes are really about achieving that larger objective. Have you, we said that there was this larger cause that we were trying to improve, right? Again, the cause that we were talking about earlier was, let's say there's a lack of wildlife education, right, as one of the root causes. Just because people are trained, right? So training people means that you've now met the output, right? Now we've trained people. But the question is, have you actually achieved the outcome of your objective, which was you wanted to improve, you wanted to have more wildlife education, right? Or let's say maybe you wanted to have more knowledge of wildlife. So it's really about achieving the larger objective that you wanted to achieve, as opposed to just people being trained. Because often what happens in projects is that people will train people, for example, and they'll say, look at all these people we've trained. But the larger question is, okay, you've trained people, but have you actually changed attitudes, which was what your larger goal was? Patrick, I don't know if you have anything else you wanted to chime in on that.
Yeah, I think that last point is really, really helpful, right? Like the outputs is sort of like what you're doing, and the outcomes is like that actual impact in the results. And so when we think about what we might want to do with this project, it's not really super helpful if we just train a bunch of people to understand about wildlife human conflict, for example. But if we're actually reducing it, that's the outcomes that we're seeking. And we really want to be focused on that, because those really, at the end of the day, are the things that matter. But yeah, thanks, Alex. That was great.
Okay, awesome. All right, thanks, Patrick. Okay, so let's take 5 minutes now, and again, look back at your problem tree and think about the questions I mentioned here, right? Think about, how do you make your goal, or how do you change the problem to a goal? And then how do you pick at least one cause and think about how to make that an objective? And then you can start brainstorming too about, okay, is there an activity I could imagine that we could do that would actually help to make progress towards achieving this objective? So I'll give you 5 minutes, and I guess that song will come next. The Jeremy Loop's Dreaming.
Yeah, here's our music by request.
Say we could go where our dreams were realized. Make a little sacrifice. It's a secret I look at. Paradise, all that's inside. Just question it sometimes. Just want to see it clear. And it feels like there's nowhere to run. There's nowhere to hide from the purple divide in this world. There's nowhere to run. I've been reading On this road, your beliefs can fade away. I'm only offering what I made. I just hope we find it sooner. Not alone, not alone. We've all felt out of place. Just a shade in the human race. And I can look right through ya. When it feels like there's nowhere to run, run, run. There's nowhere to hide from the hurtful divide in this world. There's nowhere to run, 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 run. I've been dreaming again about the revolution in my head. I've been dreaming again. I've been dreaming again about the revolution in my head. I've been dreaming again. Well, I've been dreaming again. I've been dreaming. I've been dreaming. I've been dreaming.
That's it for the song. I don't know how we're doing on time.
Okay, we got one more minute. That was a great song, though. I was really vibing to that. It was great. Okay. So I think go ahead and wrap up. Any last thoughts you have as you're finishing this up? So I think in the interest of time, let's go ahead and just wrap up. And I see a few people have put in the chat here, Albertina, I see you had some solutions for working with rhinos because the problem you talked about, right, was rhino extinction. And I think and I noticed some of the solutions you mentioned, which I think actually would be great activities. So for example, so in your solutions, one of the things you say is support local communities by offering alternatives to poaching, because most of the time the locals are the ones poaching and selling the horns to the black market because they do not see another way to survive. Right. So in that case, right, your goal might be, or your objective might be, right, provide alternative livelihoods to poaching for locals. And then you would think about, okay, what are, right, some specific activities you could do, right? Ways that you could give them alternative livelihoods, right? For example, for giving them more options. Okay, I see a question from Nadine. A question: if one reaches a desired output, is there a tool to use to maintain it after a successful project? How do we make sure the desired output stays as is? That's a great question. One major challenge with any project is a question of evaluation and a question of long-term effects, right? One of the biggest challenges with many projects is that, there's funding, right? The project cycle will be 1 or 2 years. There'll be funding for 1 or 2 years, and then the funding dries up, people move on, and it's hard to know whether or not the effects last. So I think in any project, a big question is long-term, and one of the best ways to do that really is local ownership, right? So whoever you're working with as part of the project, making sure that they really buy into and believe in what you're working on, which is why I think one of the reasons Namibia has been so successful, right, in a lot of its conservation efforts, is because they've really focused on this kind of locally led model of conservation, right, and local ownership and local empowerment, and people really, feeling like it's something that they want to and need to work on. And so the more and this is also why including project beneficiaries is so critical, right? Really making sure that the people you're working with are involved so that they feel ownership, they feel like they've been included throughout along the way, and it's something that they want to keep continuing, because you're right, that if there isn't buy-in, then things aren't going to last long term. And so I don't know if there's really a tool to do that, but it's something to always think about and try to address. Okay, so in the interest of time, I want us to talk very briefly about theories of change. We just have a couple more minutes, but it's another really important piece of project design, which is critical when it comes to thinking about trying to make a positive impact through any project you're doing. So theories of change are the assumptions behind project choices, right? If we think about a theory, right, a theory is the underlying logic behind how something works or how something happens, right? And so a theory of change is really stepping back and thinking, okay, we want to make a difference, but how do we believe we're going to make a difference? So a theory of change identifies a goal, it identifies the objectives, but then it clearly identifies the preconditions for achieving goals and objectives. So it can be thought of, and the best way to think of it is as an if-then statement, right? If we do something, then something will happen. And why it's so important, I have a little slide here. So hopefully some of you like Parks and Recreation, but we have Andy here saying, I have no idea what I'm doing, but I know I'm doing it really, really well. So the whole idea of a theory of change is thinking like really being intentional and specific about why it is we're doing what we're doing, and having clear ideas about we're doing this because we think this will happen as a result. So let me give you an example of an if-then statement. And this is actually kind of a rewording of a local organization in Tanzania of their theory of change, right? So they say, if communities take the lead in managing natural resources and in realizing more benefits from these resources, then wildlife will thrive over vast landscapes with open migratory routes. Right, so this is their intentional logic behind everything that they're doing. And so the idea is you have a theory of change that drives everything that you're doing, and then you might develop a number of projects that then kind of fit into your underlying theory of change and logic. Creating a theory of change, right? Ideally, you'd want to get stakeholders in a room. It's similar to a problem tree. It looks at causes and effects, and the other way it works is it starts with the overall goal and it works backwards, right? We say, oh, and that's how we get to the if-then statement, right? The idea is, okay, we want this goal. Okay, well, to achieve this goal, what do we need? We need to do this. Okay, well, to do that, what do we need? We need to do this, right? So you kind of work backwards to determine how it is you're going to actually get to your goal. So there's different levels of preconditions that lead up to that. And ideally, you want to have indicators and a timeline for each precondition. And when it comes to developing a theory of change, it's really helpful to read, right? It's really helpful to look at the practice-oriented literature and the social science literature, right? So the practice-oriented literature, look at organizations doing similar projects. I just showed you a theory of change from an organization doing similar type of work, right? So a great place to start would be looking at a bunch of organizations and thinking about okay, how do we develop a theory of change that's similar? And then look at projects with the same problems in this and context, right? Another thing to do is you can read, more typical scholarly research. And you can find studies on your dependent variable, right? So the thing that you're trying to change, you can find studies that talk about how that thing has been changed before. Okay, so I'm just going to leave you with a few things to think about as we kind of wrap up here. So here are some things to think about as you move forward on your projects, right? So consider if there's a theory of change that's foundational to how you want to improve wildlife conservation through your project in Namibia. If there is time, as always, it's helpful to work backwards. So start with the specific goal that you want to achieve. Consider the steps you need to fulfill to achieve that goal. And again, each step should be connected by an if-then causal chain. So you're going to think about one or two of the objectives that you want to work on that contribute to your goal. You're going to consider things that you would need to be in place to achieve these objectives. In other words, what specific activities would you need to engage in? And then the larger question is, what's your theory of change that drives this project? What is your if-then statement? Okay, so I know I'm out of time, so I want to stop there. And yeah, just, I don't know, Patrick, I know we're out of time, so I don't know if there's any like last burning questions or anything else to cover, but just want to turn it back over to you. And yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. This is really helpful because we really wanted to use this structure as we're thinking about both the solutions and the challenges that we're addressing. So I really appreciate it. I'll maybe just give the group, if there's any final clarifying questions for Alex, you can share them in the chat or unmute yourselves. Otherwise, we can certainly get a little bit deeper into this in future group conversations and in your small groups when they're formed. But yeah, final questions for Alex, anybody? Well, let's give him a big round of applause and just thanks for joining our community. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me, Patrick. And good luck to all of you on your projects. I'm really excited. It was really exciting to learn more about Namibia and the great work going on there in terms of conservation. So good luck to all of you. And yeah. And of course, I'll be happy to share the slides and everything. So yeah, thank you so much.
Sounds great. Well, take care, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks again, Alex. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Patrick. Thanks, everybody. Bye.